Little girl knocked and said they beaten my mama. She is dying giant rancher. Shocked them all. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I had seen 36 relentless winters come and go on this earth, but the lines etched into my face seemed carved by 40 years of regret and 50 years of deep-seated solitude. Arthur Vance. That was the name I carried, but in the desolate settlement they just called me the Giant. It was the only thing they needed to know about me, the only fact they cared to memorize. My shoulders were wide, broad enough to brace against the gales that swept off the high granite peaks, and my hands thick and scarred from decades of demanding ranch work. Felt less like human appendages and more like blunt heavy tools, hammers or stones. I was a widower, and the crushing weight of that single word widower settled on me like the crushing pressure of a granite slab. There were no children to bear my name forward, no bursts of laughter to chase the perpetual shadows from the corners of this old log cabin. My Sarah, my beautiful, kind Sarah, had been gone 10 long aching years, and every year since felt less like genuine living and more like standing a perpetual lonely guard over her silent grave. The cabin, now my only true companion, was a cold, dark place built by my own aching, clumsy hands. Its logs were stained black by the relentless storms of the past and the unending, suffocating smoke of my own deep internal fires. At night the habit never broke. I would sit by the roaring hearth, the chair opposite mine remaining as profoundly empty as the other half of my cold, lonely bed. That chair had become an absolute monument to my isolation. I never sat in it. I never dared to move it. It just was a constant, silent, brutal reminder of what I had lost and what I knew I would never, ever regain. The men in town knew my imposing size, of course. They always spoke of my sheer, terrifying strength before they ever spoke of my silence. They'd mutter Arthur Vance strong as a mountain ox. But the absolute truth of me lived not in the power of my back, but in the oppressive, crushing weight of my quiet. I avoided the loud saloon, actively avoided the boisterous, drunken laughter of neighbors, avoided the pitying glances of women who thought in their vanity that they might be the one to save me. I kept my words few and my entire world smaller. Still the cabin, the worn barn, and the snow-dusted, unforgiving skeletal acres of my ranch land. That evening, the air had pressed down close, heavy, and utterly unforgiving. It carried the sharp, biting scent of pine wood smoke and the profound, deadly promise of a fresh, brutal snowstorm. I had just wrestled a heavy, frozen log, one that required both my aching hands and all my concentration into my massive arms, intending to throw it onto the embers to sustain the heat. That was when the sound broke the silence. It was not the wind. I knew the wind, its many voices, its endless cruel lies. It was not the loose rattling sound of the cottonwood branches outside the window. This sound was deliberate, a knock, sharp, hurried, and profoundly trembling. I paused, the log still straining my powerful arms, my head instinctively lifting. Every animal instinct within me sharpened in the profound, crushing stillness that followed the sound. No one came to my door after true dark in the dead of this bitter winter, not without a reason that was either desperate or actively dangerous. I lowered the log slowly, carefully, setting it down without a sound upon the stone hearth. My worn boots made no noise on the floorboards as I moved toward the door, my massive scarred hand reaching for the latch. I pulled the heavy door open with an unnaturally cautious, tentative hand. There she stood, framed against the swirling, savage backdrop of the prairie night. Small as a newly hatched bird and near as utterly fragile. A girl perhaps no older than 7 years of age. Her hair was a tangle of damp, dark strands plastered to her head with melting snow. Her cheeks were blotched a painful raw red from the penetrating sub-zero cold. She wore only a thin, single-layer cotton dress, its hem torn and muddy, offering absolutely no defense against the winter's savage, biting breath. Her boots, I saw them immediately, were so thin, so worn. The raw, chilblain toes of her small feet peeked out purple and tragically exposed. Her eyes, they were wide not just from the cold, which was severe enough, but from a deeper, more profound, soul-chilling terror that had settled in her young soul like the relentless frost that covered the window panes. She looked up at me. Arthur Vance, a giant shadow filling the doorway, a wall of silence, an imposing size, and whispered words that hung in the sub-zero air like the fragile smoke from a dying fire. They beat my mama. She's in too much pain to walk. She told me to run. I felt the words strike against the heavy, armored silence of my cabin, echoing into the immense, empty spaces I thought I had sealed off forever. For a paralyzing moment, I could not move. I was a man of action, of physical strength and brutal labor, but these 7 simple words immobilized me completely. The girl's lips trembled violently, but she did not weep. She had run utterly out of tears, I realized with a sudden, sickening clarity. She stood there with a desperate, heartbreaking dignity that no child should ever have to possess, holding herself together, as though she believed she could somehow keep the world from completely shattering, if she only stood still enough, quiet enough. My voice, when I finally forced it out, came out low and rough like the deep grinding rumble of earth just before a storm breaks open. "Who is your mama, child?" I asked. She swallowed hard. I saw the thinness of her throat beneath the smudges of dirt across her young skin. "Eliza Thorne. Mary Eliza Thorne," she said, her voice hitched a small, fragile sound. They left her at the shack by the creek. She can't get up. Please, sir, please help her before the snow covers her. Eliza Thorne." The name was like a half-forgotten tune from a past life. I had seen her once or twice in the settlement. A woman of soft, almost fragile features, though they were always dulled by an unbearable, constant weariness. Her eyes were invariably downcast, especially when her husband was near. Jedediah Thorne. That was the husband's name. Broad-shouldered, yes, but quick with the rot-gut whiskey, and quicker still with his heavy, careless fists. I had witnessed Jedediah bark at her in the general store, once his hand hovering too near her delicate face, and I had watched her wilt like a tender stalk of grass beneath a heavy, unfeeling boot. And I had turned away, just like all the other men, not out of outright cruelty perhaps, but out of the ancient, terrible Western truth we all lived by. Another man's home, his property, was not yours to trespass upon, even when the cruelty was visible and loud for all to hear. Now, hearing her name from the lips of this frozen, utterly terrified child, the sound pierced through my silence far deeper than the winter wind could have ever managed. I crouched low, the porch boards creaking and groaning loudly under the unfamiliar sudden shift of my great weight. I needed to reduce my height to lessen the terrifying looming shadow I cast. "What's your name, little one?" I asked again, gentler this time, focusing only on the child. "Clara," she whispered. I saw her eyes glisten, but the tears still refused to fall. I studied the faint, fading bruises on her small arms, the way she clutched the torn sleeve of her dress, as if it were the only shield, the only protective armor she possessed. Something hardened inside me, then something that had been dormant for 10 years. Not a loud, burning anger that explodes and is gone quickly, but a quiet, deep-seated elemental fury that runs like fire hidden in the deep roots of an old, stubborn tree. It was a terrifying realization that my years of silence had been nothing less than complicity. "Get inside," I told her, standing tall again. My voice was steady, leaving absolutely no room for argument or debate. "Get by the fire. You're shaking too hard to stand." The girl hesitated, her eyes flickering up my chest to my face. She was clearly unsure if she could possibly trust a man so large, so stern, so utterly silent. But when the wind gusted, shrieking and nearly knocking her sideways off the porch, she stumbled past me into the blessed, life-saving warmth of the hearth. I pulled my heavy oilskin coat tighter around my shoulders, secured the latch on the door behind her, and strode out into the unforgiving night. My boots broke a quick, steady, determined trail across the fresh, deep layer of snow. The shack by the creek, lay a mile off, cutting through the skeleton-like bare branches of the cottonwoods that rattled like dead bones in the wind. The cold pressed like an iron hand against my face, but my steps never once faltered. I carried no lantern. I trusted the pale, faint wash of the moon that struggled through the cloud cover, and my own absolute, profound memory of the unforgiving land. The shack finally came into view. It was a sagging ruin of ill-fitted logs and broken shingles, and there was no smoke long gone from its rusted chimney. I pushed the door open. The rough, splintered wood groaned loudly on its rusted hinges, a sound like a cry of pain. Inside, the air was thick and fetid, a terrible miasma of damp straw, stale, pungent whiskey, and the metallic scent of old, dried blood. In the corner, upon a meager, thin pallet of rags and straw, lay the woman Eliza Thorne. Even in the profound, crushing shadows of that desolate room, her injuries told their own sickening, undeniable story. Her cheek was swollen, already turning a deep, angry purple, and one eye was nearly swollen completely shut. Her lips were split clearly, the mark of a heavy, careless, repeated hand. Her arms showed the telltale marks of rough, handling her wrists raw and chafed where I suspected rope or rough bindings had burned the skin. Yet her gaze, when it lifted and finally met mine, was not pleading or pathetic. It was a hard, steady stare, proud even, as though she would rather die on the cold, unforgiving dirt floor than beg another human soul for mercy or charity. I stepped closer, my looming shadow filling the small, miserable space. Eliza's voice came out hoarse and painfully thin, a mere wisp of sound in the cold air. "You shouldn't have come, Mr. Vance. They'll talk. They'll ruin you for this kindness." I knelt slowly. The floorboards creaked in protest beneath my immense weight. I looked directly into her bruised, terrible yet defiant face. "Let them talk," I murmured, my voice heavy. My mind was a million miles away, remembering my Sarah, frail and thin at the end, holding my hand, her voice too weak to ask me to stay. I hadn't been able to save her from the sickness that took her. But I could do this. I would do this. I slid my arms beneath her, my big, rough, clumsy arms, with a profound tenderness that utterly belied my size, lifting her as though she weighed absolutely nothing at all. She was light, terribly light, a fact that made the cold fury in my gut burn hotter, deeper. Her breath hitched sharply at the sudden necessary movement, but she did not protest. She simply closed her eyes, perhaps from the deep well of shame, or perhaps from the strange, unfamiliar, terrifying safety she must have felt in my grasp. I carried her out through the deep snow, my heavy coat draped around her slight, frail frame, her head resting against my broad chest. I felt her shallow, quick breaths against my throat. The storm seemed impossibly to ease its relentless howl as we moved, as though even the unforgiving winter paused to witness the small, necessary moment of human defiance. Back at the cabin, Clara ran to the door, her small hands clasped tight together against her mouth. When she saw her mother, her mama, safe in my arms, her face lit with a relief that made her seem years older and years younger all at once. I carried Eliza inside and laid her gently upon my own bed, the only bed in the cabin. She stirred, whispering faintly that she couldn't take my place, that she would be fine sleeping on the floor near the fire. I hushed her with a quiet, firm shake of my head. Clara climbed onto the bed beside her mother, tucking herself close, her thin body trembling from the day's profound ordeal. I moved to the hearth, stoking the fire higher, feeding the hungry flames until they crackled strong and bright. I fetched warm water, tore strips of clean cloth, and with my rough but infinitely careful hands began to clean Eliza's terrible wounds. She winced, often biting her lip against the pain, but she never cried out, her silent endurance heartbreaking to witness. I worked in a profound, deep silence, the kind of silence that spoke more than 1,000 words ever could. Each steady gesture, each gentle pressure of the cloth spoke a vow my lips could not yet form. "You are safe here, Eliza Thorne, and no hand will ever strike you again." Days of shelter and whispers outside. The snow fell heavier, still blanketing the prairie in a blinding, unforgiving white, turning the world into a vast, featureless graveyard. Yet within the rough logs of my cabin, a fragile new warmth took root. Clara's breathing softened into the deep sleep of exhaustion beside her mother. Eliza's eyes half closed with weariness, and the sudden, profound absence of pain flicked once toward me as I sat by the fire. My broad shoulders were bent forward, my face lined by both the firelight and a feeling much deeper, the quiet ache of a man who had carried too much silence for too long. She wanted desperately to speak, to thank me, but I saw the raw, heavy weight of shame hold her tongue. Still, for the first time in 10 years, I watched her close her eyes with a small, visible measure of peace. But peace was a fragile, dangerous, and very temporary thing in these lands. Already across the frozen miles in the town's only tavern, Jedediah Thorne's voice was carrying, loud and bitter, slurring over spilled whiskey and broken promises. He was telling anyone who would listen, and they all listened, hungry for gossip, that his wife had been stolen, that the giant miller Arthur Vance had taken her into his bed, shaming him. He spat my name with venom, vowing to reclaim what was his, to make me bleed for violating the Western truth of ownership. Men muttered and nodded. They were always eager for drama, for scandal, for a story to fill the long, dull, cold winter nights. The narrative was simple and cruel. The giant had stolen another man's woman. Back at the cabin, I stood from the fire, looking down upon the sleeping mother and child. Something profound stirred in me I had not felt since Sarah was alive. Not simple desire, not yet, but the raw, terrifying pulse of responsibility. A feeling of belonging, of having a purpose that transcended mere cattle and fences. I stepped to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. The prairie stretched dark and endless, the new snow faintly lit by the moon. Somewhere out there, I knew Jedediah was sharpening his rage, twisting the truth until it perfectly suited his broken, violent pride. My jaw tightened. My hand rested against the wood of the window frame, steady as a foundation stone. I had made my choice the moment I lifted Eliza from that dirt floor. Whatever came now, I would not let her fall again. And so as the wind howled and the fire crackled low, my cabin became more than a shelter from winter. It became a fortress, a battleground of whispers, a place where one man's profound silence would stand against another's furious drunken roar. Outside, the voices of the town already whispered that Vance had brought home another man's wife. And in towns like ours, such whispers were always sharper and more cutting than any knife. The firelight hummed low, throwing my long shadow against the timber walls, while outside the world was locked in early winter silence. I rose before dawn as always, though the simple rhythm of my days had shifted dramatically and irrevocably. I was no longer tending only to my own survival, my own internal grief. I was also tending to two profoundly fragile souls who had been thrust into my reluctant keeping. Eliza still lay in my bed. Her bruises had begun to mottle into deep, sickly hues of yellow and green, and her body, though still weak and thin, was starting to mend. The low-grade fever had thankfully broken, and color was slowly returning to her lips. She would wake to the smell of boiled cornmeal and thick, plain broth, simple, steady food I prepared with my clumsy, enormous hands. I was never a man of kitchens, but my inherent silence carried into the way I stirred the pot, into the precise, careful way I set the tin bowl beside her without ever making a comment or an expectation. She would murmur a quiet, "Thank you," her voice barely more than a thread, and I would nod, once returning to my place by the hearth. I feared that my very presence, my intimidating size, might utterly overwhelm her. I tried to make myself small, an invisible fixture in the corner. Clara, ever watchful, clung close to her mother. Her small, thin hand was always seeking Eliza's, even in sleep. But slowly, as the long, frozen days stretched on, the child's eyes began to wander toward me. She watched the way my giant hands split the thick firewood, the way my heavy boots thudded against the floor, the way my shoulders seemed wide enough to shield the entire cabin from the storm itself. In her heart, a quiet, profound trust was beginning to form. It was not a spoken trust, but one lived in the small ways, the way she dared to smile a small, tentative crack in her fearful armor when I offered her a freshly carved wooden figure. It was a little horse, whittled painstakingly in the evening silence. She held it tight, clutching it as though it were the most valuable, fragile piece of gold, whispering it to sleep beside her on the small pallet near the fire. Eliza noticed these things. I knew she did, even though she would not let her gaze linger long on me. The raw shame pressed heavily upon her, heavier, I knew, than the physical bruises Jedediah had left. To be in another man's home, to be under his care, meant the poisonous whispers would be born in town before the week was out. She knew the way of gossip. She had heard the vicious cluck of tongues even before the blows had started, women muttering about her husband's terrible temper, of her weakness in never leaving him. Now those same cruel mouths would shape even sharper, more damning words. Fallen woman, shameless whore, unfit mother. The knowledge settled on her like a cold, inescapable layer of frost. I felt the immense weight, too. Every time I hitched my wagon to haul hay or rode into the settlement for supplies, I knew the eyes followed me. Men in the saloon spoke low, but not so low that the words couldn't reach me. He's finally found his use, the giant. A keeper for another man's stray. Women paused their knitting on porches, their glances sliding like sharp, rusty knives across my back. I said nothing. I had lived with silence long enough to let it become an armor plate. Yet inside, when I returned to the cabin, the air seemed impossibly softer. It was filled with Clara's careful, newfound laughter as she tried on my heavy, oversized hat, or Eliza's quiet, faint humming as she stirred the broth. Those simple, small sounds carved through my decades of solitude in ways no gossip could ever undo. One morning, the bell of the small church in town tolled across the frozen plain, summoning the faithful. It was a painful, agonizing decision for Eliza, but I hitched my wagon anyway. The child, I decided, deserved the simple warmth of prayer, and the woman, despite her profound fear, deserved to feel the world again, even if that world was poised and ready to judge her. Eliza resisted, clutching Clara's hand with desperate strength. "They will stare, Arthur," she whispered, using my first name for the first time, a sound that oddly shook me to my core. "They will condemn us both and ruin you for saving us." I met her gaze, my dark eyes steady. "Let them," I simply said. And so she dressed in her plainest shawl, covering the worst of her still healing face, and climbed into the wagon, her daughter pressed close to her side. The church was small, the wood worn smooth by years of weather, its windows frosted blindingly white. Inside, the heat from the big stove met the chill of suspicion. Conversations faltered, abruptly dying in the air as I led Eliza to a pew near the back. Children peeked over their mothers' shoulders, only to be yanked away with fierce, hissed whispers of disapproval. Reverend Hodges, old and grave, lifted his sermon, but his eyes lingered a beat too long upon Eliza, as though weighing the sheer impropriety of her presence. She bowed her head, her cheeks instantly burning with shame. Clara fidgeted, looking up to me for guidance and comfort. I rested one of my large, clumsy hands on her shoulder, stilling her completely with the simple, immense weight of my presence. After the service, Mrs. Prudence Calloway, the town's acknowledged sharpest tongue, cornered Eliza at the worn wooden steps. My dear Prudence began with a smile too sickeningly sweet to be kind, her eyes sharp and assessing. It must be hard to endure such trials, but perhaps it would be more fitting if you stayed with kin. Folks are talking, you know. Whispers are traveling faster than the stagecoach this week. Eliza, already trembling beneath the scrutiny, found her voice failing her. She could only manage a choked, pathetic sound. My shadow fell across them, sudden and immense, blocking the winter Sunday. My gaze settled heavy and unmoving upon Prudence. Without a single word, I stepped closer, my silence sharper and more cutting than any verbal rebuke could have been. Prudence's smile instantly faltered. She muttered something vague about prayer and scurried off, her voluminous skirts brushing the fresh snow in her haste. That night, Eliza sat by the fire, her eyes shining with unshed, frustrated tears. "I've brought ruin upon you, Arthur." She whispered the words, tearing out of her with raw pain. "They'll never forgive this act of kindness you've shown us." I looked up from the piece of wood I was meticulously carving. My voice came out slow, measured, and steady. "It isn't forgiveness I'm after, Eliza. It's peace. For you. For Clara." Her breath caught sharply, for no man had spoken to her that way in years. Not as something broken, not as something owned, but as someone absolutely worthy of fundamental peace and a second chance at life. She turned away quickly, hiding the sudden flush of warmth and unfamiliar hope that crept into her bruised face. The fire that draws shadows days, folded into one another, each marked by new snowfalls, and the relentless, comforting crackle of firewood. Eliza began to regain her strength quickly. She rose from the bed to sweep the floor, to mend my worn, patched shirts with careful, professional stitches. She moved slowly, but with a renewed, quiet purpose. Her presence, I noticed, filled the cabin not as a burden, but as a quiet, essential life. I often found myself pausing in my chores, just listening to her soft, tuneless humming, as she worked a sound that seemed to knit the cabin walls tighter than any new timber. Yet the outside world only grew sharper, colder, and more insistent in its demands. In the saloon, Jedediah Thorne's voice, fueled by endless pints of rotgut, rang louder than ever. His pride, that fragile, volatile thing, was stung far deeper than any of his fists had ever struck. He spat that I had stolen his wife, that she belonged to him, that no giant could hide her away from the law and custom of the land. Men laughed, some mocking Jedediah, but most of them feeding his simmering fury. He drank deeper and faster, promising that he would ride out, gather men if need be, and drag her back by her hair if that was what it took to restore his honor. The weary old sheriff, a man named Brody, warned him to keep the peace. But Jedediah only sneered and promised a public violent spectacle that would teach the giant a lesson. News of these escalating threats reached Eliza through whispered warnings in the general store. She returned to the cabin, pale and profoundly shaken. "He'll come for me, Arthur," she told me, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't manage to untie her bonnet. "He'll never stop. His pride won't let him rest." I set aside my whittling knife, my jaw hardening. "Let him come," I said simply and without inflection. My words carried no boast, no loud anger, only a certainty that made her heart quiver. For the first time she believed Jedediah might truly be stopped, though the thought brought both immense relief and raw, terrible terror. Clara, sensing the growing storm gathering on the horizon, clung tighter to me. One evening, after I thought she was asleep, she crept from her pallet to where I sat carving by the fire. "You won't let him hurt Mama again, will you, Arthur?" she whispered, her voice tiny and full of profound, childish faith. I lifted her carefully into my lap, my great hands holding her gently, securely. "Not while I draw a breath, Clara," I promised her. "That is my absolute word." The child pressed her head against my chest, listening to the deep, steady, safe beat of my heart. She fell asleep there, finally safe after years of terror. Eliza watched me from the bed, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. She had once believed that all men carried violence in their hands, that it was the inherent brutal nature of the world. But here was one man who carried a child as though she were the finest piece of fragile glass, who tended terrible bruises with a kind of reverence, who bore immense shame and gossip in silence, rather than let it fall upon those weaker than him. Something fragile and profoundly dangerous stirred within her, a hope she had buried deep years ago. But hope, as I knew well from losing Sarah, was a fire that always drew the worst shadows. One evening, as I returned from town with supplies, a new sack of flour, a small piece of licorice for Clara, I found a note crudely nailed to my door. The words were scrolled angrily in charcoal, big and messy: "She's mine. Bring her out, or I'll bring men to take her. You'll regret the day you met me, giant. The storm is coming." I tore the note down, crumbling it into a tight, hard ball in my fist. I looked into the cabin where Eliza was stirring soup, where Clara played with her wooden horse upon the worn floor, and I felt the line of my life shift forever. I could no longer pretend this was only shelter, only simple human kindness. The world had finally chosen sides, and by opening my door to the broken and the hurting, I had declared my own. As the snow thickened outside, the cabin glowed with firelight, a fragile, precious beacon of warmth. Yet beneath that warmth, a reckoning drew near, carried on the hooves of a man who would not rest until his wounded pride was fed. In the silence, before I finally settled for sleep, Eliza whispered into the dark, half to herself, half to the man who sat unmoving in his chair, "You'll lose everything for me, Arthur. Your land, your reputation, maybe your life." I did not answer her. I only stared into the fire, my jaw set, my eyes reflecting the furious warning flames. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters as though the very land itself braced for the terrible thing that was coming. The storm gathers and breaks. The true storm announced itself first with a low, mournful moan across the prairie. It was a sound that carried in the vast distance like the warning cry of a great savage animal stirring from its deep slumber. I felt it deep in my bones long before the sky finally broke an ache, a deep pressure behind the eerie stillness that made the few cattle restless in the far pasture. The air turned sharp, laced with the metallic scent of iron and deep snow, and the entire horizon thickened with a black, crushing weight rolling steadily closer. I worked quickly to secure the barn doors, the rope taut and biting beneath my frozen hands, my breath fogging violently in the deepening cold. Behind me, the cabin stood against the gray like a solitary sentinel, its windows already glowing faintly with the fire's light. The only warmth, the only spark of life for miles in any direction. Inside, Eliza moved with quiet, desperate urgency. She gathered the few pieces of laundry from the line, shuttered the windows, and tucked what meager food we had into covered bins. It felt less like preparing for weather, and more like preparing for a desperate final siege. Her hands trembled often, though she forced them steady through sheer will. Clara followed at her skirts, clutching the carved wooden horse that had become her constant talisman, a small piece of solid, unchanging wood in a chaotic world. Each new violent crack of wind outside made the child press closer to her mother, her wide eyes watching Eliza's face for any cue of safety or terror. Eliza, her bruises now, a soft, sickly yellow, tried desperately to mask her profound fear, but the child saw more than she ever spoke. By true dusk, the first true lash of the gale struck, rattling the cabin timbers and sending snow in heavy slanted sheets across the land. I entered, carrying with me the raw, stinging bite of frost, my shoulders dusted and thick white. I shut the heavy door hard against the gale and stood for a long moment, simply listening. The storm's voice was a deep, guttural howl circling the cabin, seeming to seek entry through every crack and crevice. I turned then, my gaze sweeping over the two souls by the roaring fire. Eliza met my eyes, the question, unspoken, raw fear visible in their depth. I gave her a slow, steady nod, not exactly reassurance, but an acknowledgement that the terrifying storm outside was not the only one we must face tonight. I knew the word had reached me in town earlier that day. Jedediah Thorne, fueled by cheap drink and his immense wounded pride, had sworn before a circle of rapt men that he was coming to reclaim his wife. He spat venom into every glass, boasting he would not come alone but with others, who carried his bitterness, men who were always glad to fan the fire of scandal into an all-consuming flame. I had not answered the talk, but my silence this time had not been mistaken for fear. Those who saw the tight, hard set of my jaw, the unnerving stillness in my eyes, knew that the giant rancher was bracing himself for a necessary reckoning. Now, as the storm thickened, Eliza sensed the enormous weight upon me. She stood by the fire, her shawl pulled tight around her frail shoulders, her face lit by the intense flicker of the flames. "Do you truly think he will come in this weather, Arthur?" she asked softly, though her voice carried no hope, only profound dread. I looked toward the window where the snow whirled like malicious ghosts against the glass. "If a man's rage is hot enough, Eliza," I said, "even this storm won't be able to cool it down. He is past reason." She turned away her hand, automatically brushing her daughter's hair. For so long she had endured Jedediah's wrath, bending beneath it, surviving but never truly resisting. Now the thought of him returning with others at his back made her stomach knot with fear. Yet there was also something else, a small persistent ember of defiance, sparked by the sight of her child sleeping warm by a safe fire, by the profound knowledge that her pain no longer went completely unseen. I, Arthur Vance, had lifted her from the cold dirt, not with pity or charity, but with a kind of strength that carried no expectation, only the absolute promise of protection. That ember of defiance glowed brighter each passing day, and though the fear pressed heavy now, it did not entirely snuff out the fire. The hours stretched long. I moved relentlessly from door to window, checking the latches, tightening the shutters, every single movement steady and measured. Clara drowsed against her mother's lap, her small breaths soft against the storm's continuous roar. Eliza watched me, the giant man by the door, the way I seemed carved from the same unyielding timber as the cabin itself. Unyielding, enduring. She wondered what impossible weight I carried in my silence, what profound grief still hollowed my eyes when the firelight caught them. She longed to ask me to trespass on my own solitude, yet the necessary words failed her, entirely choked by years of fear. Instead, she finally whispered a song to me under her breath. It was a fragment of a comfort she must have known in her own forgotten childhood, the notes soft but steady, weaving themselves into the fabric of the storm's noise. I paused at the door, listening. For the very first time in years, a simple human sound touched the deep emptiness within me. A terrible, beautiful reminder that homes were not built of logs and nails alone, but of the voices that finally filled the immense hollow spaces between storms. But the night could not belong to peace. Near midnight, over the relentless howl of the wind, came another sound. Faint at first, then chillingly clear, hoofbeats. The distinct crunch of horses through the deep snow, deliberate drawing steadily closer. I froze, my hand immediately resting upon the heavy rifle I had propped against the wall. Eliza's breath hitched, her fingers tightening into white knots around Clara. The child stirred, murmured, and clutched the wooden horse tighter against her chest. "They're here," Eliza whispered, fear finally cracking her voice into a raw sound. I did not answer her. I moved quickly to the small window, peering through a tiny gap in the shutter. Against the violent swirl of snow shadows shifted mounted figures, pushing hard against the terrifying storm. I counted 3 men, perhaps 4. Their lanterns swung erratically, swaying like malicious will-o'-the-wisps, trying to draw souls to perdition. One voice cut savagely above the wind, loud, angry, slurred, unmistakably the voice of Jedediah Thorne. I stepped back, my jaw set so tight I thought the bone might break. My face was carved in cold, hard stone. I turned to Eliza. "Get her into the back room," I commanded quietly. "The small pantry. Do not open that door for anything unless you hear my voice, and only mine." She hesitated, wanting to protest, wanting to share the burden, but the profound weight in my gaze left her no choice. She gathered Clara quickly, whispering frantic comfort, though her own fear made her entire body quake. She pulled the child into the small, dark back room where blankets were piled high. The door closed softly behind them, a final terrible click. I remained in the main room, the rifle steady in my hands, though I prayed with every molecule of my being that it would not be needed. The storm rattled the very walls, but above it came the pounding, a furious, drunken, insistent pounding of fists against the cabin door. "Miller," Vance Jedediah roared, using both my known names, the venom dripping from every syllable. "You think you can steal what's mine? Bring her out, or we'll drag her out ourselves, and I'll break you first." Cruel, mocking laughter followed, though I noted. It held a tremor, the sound of men seeking courage against the combined threat of the brutal storm and the giant man waiting inside. I said nothing. Silence was my answer. The same silence that had carried me through loss, through years of unbearable loneliness, through every venomous whisper of gossip. I set the rifle against the wall. I reached instead for the heavy lantern. I lit it, the sudden flame casting my great looming shadow across the entire room. Then and only then did I unbar the door. Snow burst violently inward, the wind shrieking its rage, But I stood firm, a wall of muscle and absolute resolve, the lantern raised high. The men outside flinched at the sudden blinding light, their faces raw from the cold, their eyes red-rimmed with drink and their own bitter rage. Jedediah sat astride his horse, his figure bloated with fury, his mouth twisted into a snarl. "You've shamed me, Vance." He spat, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "You've taken my wife, poisoned her against me. I'll see you ruined and freezing before this night ends." I stepped forward onto the porch, letting the storm claw at my coat. The lantern in my hand cast long leaping shadows. My voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, and carried even through the gale's fury. "She was never yours to break, Jedediah. That is a crime of pride, not ownership." The words struck harder than any physical fist. Jedediah's face contorted, his rage boiling over. He spurred his horse forward, shouting to the others, "Drag her out. Get the woman." I set the lantern down carefully in the snow, freeing my hands. My body was instantly poised. The storm whipped around us, the snow stinging like sharp knives. The night was suddenly alive with fury. Inside the small back room, Eliza clutched Clara close, hearing the muffled shouts, the crunch and crash of heavy boots against the snow. Her heart hammered, wildly torn between sheer terror and a strange, powerful surge of strength. For years she had prayed only to endure. Now, with me standing between her and the storm, she prayed not just for safety, but for the profound courage to ensure she would never return to those chains. Clara whispered against her, her small voice trembling, "He won't let them take you, Mama." Arthur promised he wouldn't. Outside, the first of Jedediah's men finally dismounted, stumbling blindly through the deep snow toward the porch. I met him there, my great frame, a solid wall against the storm, and the sickening clash of our bodies rang sharp and immediate against the night air. Fists swung, boots slid, and snow scattered in blinding plumes. I moved with the precise, devastating power of a man who had labored all his life. Each blow I landed was precise, each step unshaken. Another man came, and then another, but still I did not falter. The storm howled louder, as if the land itself bore witness to the purity of the defense. Jedediah shouted, curses circling us on his horse, his face twisted in frustrated fury as his men faltered and fell back. He screamed my name into the night, but my silence was answer enough. The fight raged at the very edge of the porch, the lantern light flickering wildly, until at last the men staggered back, bruised, bloodied, their initial rage cooled by the unforgiving storm and the unyielding, immovable force of my defense. But Jedediah remained. His pride was greater than his fear, and perhaps greater than his sanity. He finally dismounted, stumbling forward, snow clinging to his hair and beard, his fists clenched in white knots. "This ain't over, Vance," he hissed, his voice sharp with a madness I recognized. "You think you can take her? You think you can shame me? I'll burn this place to the ground before I let her stay here. I own her." I stood in the snow, my chest heaving, my face lit by the lantern's unsteady glow. My silence now held the immense weight of a vow, my body poised not just to fight but to endure whatever storm Jedediah Thorne carried with him. The harder choice. The snow fell heavier, still cloaking the land in absolute oppressive white muffling, all sound turning the world into a frozen stage for the final necessary reckoning. The lantern flame at my feet bent low under the gale, painting light against the storm's furious canvas. Jedediah stood before me, his face twisted with rage, the storm's icy claws lashing at his coat. The beaten men who had come at his side lingered farther back, their courage utterly spent. But Jedediah's pride burned hotter than the cold itself. He advanced, fists tight, his boots crunching the frozen earth. I met him in silence. The breadth of my shoulders squared my breath, coming in steady, thick white fog. The cabin door behind me was shut tight, protecting Eliza and Clara within. I felt their nearness like a flame at my back, fragile, precious, and utterly unyielding, and it gave enormous weight to every second of the moment. Jedediah sneered through his cracked lips, his voice breaking into the wind. "You think you've won because you swung your fists and dropped my men. You think she belongs to you now. She's mine, Vance. She always will be." My reply came low, not loud, not cruel, but with the profound gravity of a man who had carried silence longer than most men had even lived. "She belongs to no man, Jedediah. She belongs to herself." The words struck him like a physical blow. Jedediah staggered at the mere thought, then surged with a renewed, desperate fury, his fist swinging wildly. I caught the blow on my forearm, the force jolting through me but not breaking my stance. I countered with a heavy, deliberate strike that sent Jedediah stumbling back into the drift snow, exploding around his form. Yet still he rose mad, with wounded pride lunging again and again. Our struggle became a desperate, clumsy dance in the storm, Jedediah flailing with the reckless abandon of a man who fears being small. I, Arthur, moving with the cold precision of one who bore a responsibility far greater than his own life. Each blow I landed carried the weight of more than just my fists. I saw in Jedediah every cruelty carved into Eliza's skin. Every single night Clara had gone to bed hungry and terrified. Every humiliation Eliza had endured in utter, terrible silence. And Jedediah, in striking me, sought not only to reclaim a wife, but to prove himself unbroken, to claw back a shred of respect from a town that had begun to turn its condemning head. We grappled boots, sliding on the ice fists, pounding the lantern light, swinging wildly, casting monstrous leaping shadows across the snow. My strength held steady, but Jedediah fought like a cornered, wounded beast. At last I caught him by the collar, my massive hand closing around the cloth, and I slammed him against the porch post. The entire wood structure shuddered, snow tumbling from the roof. Jedediah gasped blood streaking his lip, his eyes burning with an undiluted hatred. "Do it, Vance," he hissed the word, a terrible challenge. "Break me, kill me. That's what they'll expect from the giant. That's all you are, a brute." My fist hovered inches from his face. The storm raged around us, and the temptation of vengeance, hot, satisfying, and final, burned within me. But then, faint through the terrifying howl, I heard another sound. Clara's voice muffled by the cabin walls. A child's small, trembling cry calling softly, "Mama, is he gone yet? Is he gone?" That tiny, small voice pierced deeper than Jedediah's taunts. My breath steadied. I lowered my fist, though my grip remained strong, almost crushing. Killing Jedediah would only birth another ghost to haunt Eliza and her daughter, and to haunt my own remaining years. Justice was not blood upon the snow. It was dignity returned through the proper channels. I yanked Jedediah forward and flung him down hard into the drift. He scrambled, cursing, but I pressed the cold rifle barrel, which had never been fired in this conflict, against his chest, forcing him to absolute stillness. "You'll answer for what you've done," I said, my voice carrying into the night like an iron vow. "Not here and not by my hand. By the law. Sheriff Brody will be waiting." The other men finally shifted uneasily. None dared step forward, their meager loyalty utterly frayed by the savage storm and the terrifying sight of their leader brought low. I dragged Jedediah up, gripping him like a sack of grain, and half-carried, half-drove him toward his horse. Jedediah struggled weakly, spitting blood. But my profound, unyielding silence broke him more surely than any blow could have. The men mounted without a single word, cowed by my absolute giant resolve. At the edge of the yard, I thrust Jedediah into the saddle with a force that left him hanging limp and broken. "Tell the sheriff I'll be bringing him by at dawn," I stated. "And if you return here again, any of you, you'll find no storm strong enough to hide you from me." The men hesitated for a long moment, then spurred their horses, dragging the humiliated Jedediah with them into the violent, whirling dark. The hoofbeats faded, quickly swallowed by the wind. I stood for a long moment in the snow, my chest heaving, my face lit by the lantern's unsteady glow, allowing the storm to ease its fury as though it were finally satisfied with the outcome. At last I turned and stepped back inside. Warmth met me, the firelight gentle after the incredible cold. Eliza stood near the hearth, her shawl drawn close her face, pale but her eyes fierce, newly frighteningly fierce. Clara clung to her skirts, her small wooden horse pressed tight in her hand. When I shut the door, the cabin seemed to exhale as if the very walls themselves had been holding their breath alongside me. Eliza's voice trembled, though not with weakness. "You could have killed him. You had the right, Arthur. No one in this territory would have blamed you for putting him down." I walked past her to the hearth, picking up the logs I had dropped when the first knock came days ago. I laid them onto the new embers, watching the fresh fire catch. I was bruised. My knuckles were raw and bloody. But the deep existential ache I had carried for years felt strangely, profoundly eased. I did not look at her when I spoke. I could have, I agreed, my voice a low rumble. But a debt of blood is a debt that never finishes. The law will have him. That is an ending. And I finally lifted my gaze, meeting her eyes. "We have work to do now." I knelt by the bed, tucking a heavy blanket around the sleeping Clara. Then I stood, my shadow filling the cabin, no longer a ghost of my loneliness, but a wall of solid, unmoving presence. Eliza felt the very last of her fear, not of Jedediah, but of the world's crushing judgment, slip away. She stepped forward, resting a hand light as a feather on my great bruised arm. "What work is that, Arthur?" she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. I placed my large hand over hers, a touch that was both fierce in its possession and careful in its tenderness. The warmth of the cabin settled around us, a fortress against the white and wounded world. "We build a home, Eliza," I said, my gaze holding hers steady in the firelight. "Starting now, in this new silence, the one that is no longer empty but full." The final log settled on the hearth, and a perfect golden flame rose high, illuminating the man, the woman, and the child, 3 souls who had finally found shelter, not from the storm but from the cruel world that had cast them out. My long, terrible silence had ended, replaced by the quiet, fierce dignity of choice and the powerful sound of a new family forming. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.